Sexton's Adventure by Sheridan Le Fanu. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Schempf. The Sexton's Adventure by Sheridan Le Fanu. Those who remember Chapelizod a quarter of a century ago or more may possibly recollect the parish sexton. Bob Martin was held much in awe by truant boys who sauntered into the churchyard on Sundays to read the tombstones or to play leapfrog over them, or climb the ivy in search of bats or sparrows' nests, or peep into the mysterious aperture under the eastern window, which opened a dim perspective of descending steps, losing themselves among profounder darkness, where lidless coffins gaped horribly among tattered velvet, bones, and dust, which time and mortality had strewn there. Of such horribly curious and otherwise enterprising juveniles, Bob was, of course, the special scourge and terror. But terrible as was the official aspect of the sexton, and repugnant as his lank form, clothed in rusty sable vesture, his small frosty visage, suspicious grey eyes, and rusty brown scratch wig, might appear to all notions of genial frailty, it was yet true that Bob Martin's severe morality sometimes nodded, and that Bacchus did not always solicit him in vain. Bob had a curious mind, a memory well stored in merry tales and tales of terror. His profession familiarized him with graves and goblins, and his tastes with weddings, wassail, and sly frolics of all sorts. And as his personal recollections ran back nearly 80 years into the perspective of the village history, his fund of local anecdote was copious, accurate, and edifying. As his ecclesiastical revenues were by no means considerable, he was not unfrequently obliged, for the indulgence of his tastes, to arts which were, at best, undignified. He frequently invited himself when his entertainers had forgotten to do so. He dropped in accidentally upon small drinking parties of his acquaintance in public houses, and entertained them with stories, queer or terrible, from his inexhaustible reservoir, never scrupling to accept an acknowledgment in the shape of hot whiskey punch or whatever else was going. There was at that time a certain atrabilious publican called Philip Slaney, established in a shop nearly opposite the old turnpike. This man was not, when left to himself, immoderately given to drinking, but being naturally of a saturnine complexion, and his spirits constantly requiring a fillip, he acquired a prodigious liking for Bob Martin's company. The sexton's society, in fact, gradually became the solace of his existence, and he seemed to lose his constitutional melancholy in the fascination of his sly jokes and marvelous stories. This intimacy did not redound to the prosperity or reputation of the convivial allies. Bob Martin drank a good deal more punch than was good for his health, or consistent with the character of an ecclesiastical functionary. Philip Slaney, too, was drawn into similar indulgences, for it was hard to resist the genial seductions of his gifted companion, and as he was obliged to pay for both, his purse was believed to have suffered even more than his head and liver. Be this as it may, Bob Martin had the credit of having made a drunkard of Black Phil Slaney, for by this cognomen was he distinguished, and Phil Slaney had also the reputation of having made the sexton, if possible, a bigger blackguard than ever. Under these circumstances, the accounts of the concern opposite the turnpike became somewhat entangled, and it came to pass one drowsy summer morning, the weather being at once sultry and cloudy, that Phil Slaney went into the small back parlour where he kept his books, and which commanded, through its dirty window-panes, a full view of a dead wall, and having bolted the door, he took a loaded pistol, and clapping the muzzle in his mouth, blew the upper part of his skull through the ceiling. This horrid catastrophe shocked Bob Martin extremely, and partly on this account, and partly because, having been, on several late occasions, found at night in a state of abstraction bordering on insensibility, upon the high road, he had been threatened with dismissal, and, as some said, partly also because of the difficulty of finding anybody to treat him as poor Phil Slaney used to do. He, for a time, forswore alcohol in all its combinations, and became an eminent example of temperance and sobriety. Bob observed his good resolutions, greatly to the comfort of his wife, and the edification of the neighborhood, with tolerable punctuality. He was seldom tipsy and never drunk, and was greeted by the better part of society with all the honors of the prodigal son. Now it happened about a year after the grisly event we have mentioned, that the curate, having received, by the post, due notice of a funeral to be consummated in the churchyard of Chapelizod, with certain instructions respecting the site of the grave, dispatched a summons for Bob Martin with a view to communicate to that functionary these official details. It was a lowering autumn night. Piles of lurid thunder clouds, slowly rising from the earth, had loaded the sky with a solemn and boding canopy of storm. The growl of distant thunder was heard afar off upon the dull, still air, and all nature seemed, as it were, hushed and cowering under the oppressive influence of the approaching tempest. It was past 9 o'clock when Bob, putting on his official coat of seedy black, prepared to attend his professional superior. "Bob, darlin'," said his wife, before she delivered the hat she held in her hand to his keeping, "sure you won't, Bobby darlin', you won't, you know what." "I don't know what," he retorted smartly, grasping at his hat. "You won't be throwing up the little finger, Bobby acushla," she said, evading his grasp. "Ah, why would I, woman? There, give me my hat, will you?" "But you won't promise me, Bobby darlin', you won't, Alana?" "Aye, to be sure I will. Why not? There, give me my hat and let me go." "Aye, but you're not promising, Bobby mavourneen. You're not promising all this time." "Well, divil carry me if I drink a drop till I come back again," said the sexton angrily. "Will that do you? And now will you give me my hat?" "Here it is, darlin'," she said, "and God send you safe back." And with this parting blessing she closed the door upon his retreating figure, for it was now quite dark, and resumed her knitting till his return, very much relieved, for she thought he had of late been oftener tipsy than was consistent with his thorough reformation, and feared the allurements of the half-dozen publics which he had at that time to pass on his way to the other end of town. They were still open, and exhaled a delicious reek of whiskey, as Bob glided wistfully by them, but he stuck his hands in his pockets and looked the other way, whistling resolutely, and filling his mind with the image of the curate and anticipations of his coming fee. Thus he steered his morality safely through these rocks of offence, and reached the curate's lodging in safety. He had, however, an unexpected sick call to attend, and was not at home, so that Bob Martin had to sit in the hall and amuse himself with the devil's tattoo until his return. This, unfortunately, was very long delayed, and it must have been fully 12 o'clock when Bob Martin set out upon his homeward way. By this time the storm had gathered to a pitchy darkness. The bellowing thunder was heard among the rocks and hollows of the Dublin mountains, and the pale blue lightning shone upon the staring fronts of the houses. By this time, too, every door was closed, but as Bob trudged homeward, his eyes mechanically sought the public house which had once belonged to Phil Slaney. A faint light was making its way through the shutters and the glass panes over the doorway, which made a sort of dull, foggy halo about the front of the house. As Bob's eyes became accustomed to the obscurity by this time, the light in question was quite sufficient to enable him to see a man in a sort of loose riding-coat seated upon a bench, which at that time was fixed under the windows of the house. He wore his hat very much over his eyes, and was smoking a long pipe. The outline of a glass and a quart bottle were also dimly traceable beside him, and a large horse, saddled but faintly discernible, was patiently waiting his master's leisure. There was something odd, no doubt, in the appearance of a traveller refreshing himself at such an hour in the open street, but the sexton accounted for it easily by supposing that, on the closing of the house for the night, he had taken what remained of his refection to the place where he was now discussing it al fresco. At another time Bob might have saluted the stranger as he passed with a friendly "Good night," but somehow he was out of humour and in no genial mood, and was about to pass without any courtesy of the sort, when the stranger, without taking the pipe from his mouth, raised the bottle, and with it beckoned him familiarly, while with a sort of lurch of the head and shoulders, at the same time shifted his seat to the end of the bench. He pantomimically invited him to share his seat and his cheer. There was a divine fragrance of whiskey about the spot, and Bob half relented, but he remembered his promise just as he began to waver, and said, "No, I thank you, sir. I can't stop to-night." The stranger beckoned with a vehement welcome, and pointed to the vacant space on the seat beside him. "I thank you for your polite offer," said Bob, "but it's what I'm too late as it is, and haven't time to spare, so I wish you a good night." The traveller jingled the glass against the neck of the bottle, as if to intimate that he might at least swallow a dram without losing time. Bob was mentally quite of the same opinion, but, though his mouth watered, he remembered his promise, and shaking his head with incorruptible resolution, walked on. The stranger, pipe in mouth, rose from his bench, the bottle in one hand and the glass in the other, and followed at the sexton's heels, his dusky horse keeping close in his wake. There was something suspicious and unaccountable in this importunity. Bob quickened his pace, but the stranger followed close. The sexton began to feel queer, and turned about. His pursuer was behind, and still inviting him with impatient gestures to taste his liquor. "I told you before," said Bob, who was both angry and frightened, "that I would not taste it, and that's enough. I don't want to have anything to say to you or your bottle, and in God's name," he added more vehemently, observing that he was approaching still closer, "fall back, and don't be tormenting me this way." These words, as it seemed, incensed the stranger, for he shook the bottle with violent menace at Bob Martin, but, notwithstanding this gesture of defiance, he suffered the distance between them to increase. Bob, however, beheld him dogging him still in the distance, for his pipe shed a wonderful red glow, which duskily illuminated his entire figure like the lurid atmosphere of a meteor. "I wish the devil had his own, my boy," muttered the excited sexton, "and I know well enough where you'd be." The next time he looked over his shoulder, to his dismay, he observed the importunate stranger as close as ever upon his track. "Confound you!" cried the man of skulls and shovels, almost beside himself with rage and horror. "What is it you want of me?" The stranger appeared more confident, and kept wagging his head and extending both glass and bottle toward him as he drew near, and Bob Martin heard the horse snorting as it followed in the dark. "Keep it to yourself, whatever it is, for there is neither grace nor luck about you," cried Bob Martin, freezing with terror. "Leave me alone, will you?" And he fumbled in vain among the seething confusion of his ideas for a prayer or an exorcism. He quickened his pace almost to a run. He was now close to his own door, under the impending bank of the riverside. "Let me in! Let me in, for God's sake, Molly! Open the door!" he cried as he ran to the threshold, and leant his back against the plank. His pursuer confronted him upon the road. The pipe was no longer in his mouth, but the dusky red glow still lingered round him. He uttered some inarticulate, cavernous sounds, which were wolfish and indescribable, while he seemed employed in pouring out a glass from the bottle. The sexton kicked with all his force against the door, and cried at the same time with a despairing voice, "In the name of God Almighty, once for all, leave me alone!" His pursuer furiously flung the contents of the bottle at Bob Martin, but instead of fluid it issued out in a stream of flame, which expanded and whirled round them, and for a moment they were both enveloped in a faint blaze. At the same instant a sudden gust whisked off the stranger's hat, and the sexton beheld that his skull was roofless. For an instant he beheld the gaping aperture, black and shattered. Then he fell senseless into his own doorway, which his affrighted wife had just unbarred. I need hardly give my reader the key to this most intelligible and authentic narrative. The traveller was acknowledged by all to have been the spectre of the suicide, called up by the evil one to tempt the convivial sexton into a violation of his promise, sealed as it was by an imprecation. Had he succeeded, no doubt the dusky steed, which Bob had seen saddled in attendance, was destined to have carried back a double burden to the place from whence he came. As an attestation of the reality of this visitation, the old thorn tree which overhung the doorway was found in the morning to have been blasted with the infernal fires which had issued from the bottle, just as if a thunderbolt had scorched it. End of the Sexton's adventure.
Spooky Ventures is the home for spooky content and spooky merchandise on the web. Check it out today at spookyventures.com. And remember, always keep it spooky.